All right, this is my first published work. It's a short story that was published in the Arizona State University campus newspaper, and in 1989 they held what they called the Right Stuff Fiction Contest, and my story placed first. There were two others, a runner-up and another person, but mine placed first. This was 1989. I was about 21 years old. And it looks like somebody did a little painting as an illustration, or they found one. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and read it. First on the left there, I'm going to read what the judge said. She says, I try when reading a story for the first time not to notice technique. I don't consciously register point of view, sentence pattern, or tense. I read for story. On a second reading, I look for why the story works. First place winner Where the Sun Bleeds works because rich description, disturbing incidents, and spooky characters create a nightmarish landscape. A chemist's daughter tells a story that evokes the shadow side of newspaper reports about chemical warfare. She witnesses the psychological and physical degeneration of her father, a man who manufactures chemical weapons in his basement. She watches her mother, a woman forbidden to enter rooms in her own house, break down. Agent Orange rots the foundation of this American household, and because they are not simple-minded, the family cannot divorce themselves from fear and guilt. The narrator witnesses a realistic nightmare, one from which neither she nor a conscious reader can awaken. This is where the sun bleeds, my father would tell me during the evenings when we stood watching it sink red and swollen behind the slender white trees of the orchard where father had forbidden me ever to go. Right here, he would say, over this house, for me. And he would point as it disappeared, swallowed by the warm yellow evening like a giant orange. At the beginning of summer, before the brown trunks of the palm trees would slump beneath the white heat of the sun and the green fan leaves become dry and brittle, we would cross the hot black asphalt from which rising heat would transform approaching cars into gray liquid ghosts, and we would steal oranges from Old Man's orchard where the trunks had been painted white to protect them from drying up too soon. When I asked father once why he forbade me to go, he said it was because the oranges were contaminated with insecticides and would poison us. We had broken the tough, ripe skins and squeezed the juice all over our bodies, but none of us ever became sick, and when I told the other kids what father had said, they merely laughed. Our bodies would dry all sticky in the sun, and orange rinds would gather like white clay beneath our fingernails, and we would set up sprinklers on the stiff, dry lawns browned by the sun's heat and then run through pencil-thin streams of water until we dried, loose grass sticking to our feet. The smell of the oranges, bright and sweet, would remain on our hands for days, no matter how thoroughly we washed them. Mother would occasionally lie in a chair in the front yard, her skin smooth and white as ivory, and no matter how often she lay out, her body glistening with oily sweat and lotion, her skin would remain the same pure white it had always been, untouched by the sun. She would often set a jar of dark gold tea out, and sometimes I would twirl my baton near it so that she would notice me, but it rarely worked. I asked her once why one of the palm trees had begun to sag, why its leaves had become dull, flat stems unmoved by the infrequent gusts of hot wind, and she said that it was because the sun was too strong sometimes and it wasn't getting enough water. Once the heat had settled in for good, however, I stayed inside the house most of the time and drank lemonade and watched television while the rattling cooler blew a steady current of moist air through the silent house, and I would sit and listen to it, letting it flow over me, causing my clothes to stick to my skin. When I would take the milk from the refrigerator, the carton would always be covered with a layer of sweating moisture, and I would wonder where it came from as I poured myself a glass and stood drinking while father worked down in the basement, the main area of which lay directly beneath the kitchen floor. I can hear you walking around up here, he said to me once, peering out from the half-open door with a pale, sweaty face, the front of his shirt dampened with a dark layer of moisture as he wiped the gold frames of his little round spectacles with it. I don't want you doing that. It distracts my work. Why don't you go play with your friends? I don't have any, I told him. They all make fun of me. Can't I come down and watch you work? He replaced his glasses, and at once his eyes disappeared beneath twin ovals of reflected light, and he was silent a moment as he stood regarding me. Never come down here, he said. His voice was soft and quiet, barely audible above the roaring cooler which filled the house with a sound like air makes when you put a hollow seashell against your ear. Like the ocean. It's dangerous down here, he said. You could be killed. Father took me out to the desert once so that he could teach me how to survive in the heat. The problem, he said, with children my age is that they always turn up missing because someone drags them away to die out there. Benny laughed when he saw the expression on my face. We went out beyond the highway in his station wagon, where the flat yellow land becomes littered with occasional dump sites. People would drag broken furniture out there, mattresses bursting with loose stuffing, cracked porcelain sinks rusting in the heat, piles of surplus brick and wood, and huge steel frames supporting miles of electrical cable would continue on until I thought they must go across the desert forever. Sometimes while the dry wind stirred the sage bushes, the sound of a shotgun would snap into the air and then rise, echoing over the jagged brown mountains until the desert finally swallowed it up. I would sit on the back of the tailgate while Father would dig a hole into the earth and line it with stones for a fire, while the evening drew charcoal shadows over the ground and made the mountains into ominous dark giants as the smell of wood smoke would drift on the air from the rising orange fire. One night, before the last of the light had stolen from the day, I found a dead rabbit. "He's dead, isn't he, Daddy?" Father prodded the black, fly-swollen corpse with his shoe, then squatted down over it a moment, concealing it from view, and I could see the muscles in his shoulders bunching as he did something to it. "Maybe you better look again here," he said, rising and standing to the side, so that I could see in the dying orange light as it began to twitch, and then shake its head a little, as though waking from sleep. In a few minutes it was off, its brown fur blending in with the desert as the night fell. The summer went on. In the mornings the sun rose in the lavender silence like a giant orange. In the evenings it slipped behind the trees at the edge of the sky like a magnificent apple. One evening the tall men came to visit Father. They wore long black suits with red ties, and they sat at the kitchen table, two of them, beneath the pale glow of the ceiling lamp, and they smoked cigarettes while they talked with Father, manila sheets spilling from their coffee-colored briefcases over the smooth formica surface. I watched them from the living room, where Mother and I sat before the blue television screen, peering at them through the haze of cigarette smoke, colored yellow by the soft lamp like fading photographs. They began raising their voices at Father, and he raised his back louder. Printed on the shiny surface of one of their briefcases was a golden eagle bearing a leaf in one of its talons and arrows in the other, and I wanted to touch it, run my fingers over it, to see if it felt as beautiful as it looked. I crept into the kitchen just as Father was rising above them, his face a round, sweating moon, as he pointed at the locked door of the basement. "You'll never go down there," he was saying, "ever. I defy you to rain down on me any plague you can think of, but you'll never see what's down there." Then he stopped, because he had noticed me watching him, locked into immobility at the sight of his rage, and then the tall men turned and saw me too. I could hear him breathing heavily as he crossed the kitchen in silence and stood over me, looking down a moment through the flat gold circles where I knew his eyes must be. Then he raised his hand to unlatch the kitchen door, and I saw that his hand was shaking, and he closed the door in front of me as I stood listening to the angry voices which resumed a moment later. At night sometimes the walls became so hot that when you touched them they felt moist, like soft skin, and in places the paint would come away in damp flakes, so that the walls were marked with huge round ovals where they had sunken in beneath the heat. Father would come home late at night, the smell of alcohol filling the house with him, and I would listen to him tripping over furniture as he made his way to the living room, and he would pause sometimes in the hallway, and I could hear him breathing as he studied the crumbling walls, and I would know that he would be looking at the dead spots, running his palm over them with a dry, calloused sound, as though contemplating their nature. Then one night he came into my bedroom after repeating this ritual and turned on the light. My eyes burned with white as he stood talking. "Have you seen those spots?" he said. "We must be infected. I've let it spread. We have to get you out before it comes in here." He stood a moment, blinking with slow, dull eyes rimmed in pink, and looked as if he might go to sleep standing right there. "I've let it happen," he said. "Now we're infected. It's my fault." He lingered a bit longer, swaying, eyes unfocused, then shut out the light and went away. 13 years getting degrees so I can invent better ways of killing people. I heard him say this to my mother one night, as the rain fell in heavy sheets over the roof, and I lay on my bed with the covers thrown off, gazing up at the cracked, yellowing ceiling, and wondered what it meant. Then I heard my mother say something even stranger. "Put that away. You'd only hurt us more." Then the monsoons came and the sun would disappear behind a screen of floating, oily clouds, a dull white disk, powerless and slumbering as water ran in glossy black streams over the pavement, and lightning burst like snapshots beyond the stacked gray clouds lined up over the rusty copper desert. The air would grow heavy and come in through the open windows with the smell of ozone, passing moist and cool through the rapidly darkening house, while Father sat morosely on the couch in front of the empty blue slate of the television screen, his hand supporting his pale, heavy head, and I would sit watching him, wondering why he had become so quiet. Eventually, I made up a song and sang it to myself while the rain came down. Rain falls, sun sleeps, sky darkens, Father is weak. But soon the pavements would dry, the mud becoming cracked earth, and the sun would rise in a hot and copper sky like the angry head of God. Then came the evening near the end of summer when Father stood over us in the living room, while the machine hum of cicadas rose in the night through the open window behind him, his watery eyes like livid suns behind the gleam of his spectacles, white skin leaking wetly as the lamplight carved his mighty shadow into the wall behind him. In one of his hands was a clear glass of gold liquid, while the other swept abruptly through the air in a gesture meant to include the entire living room. "All this," he said, "must be taken outside and destroyed. It has become infected. A virus has contaminated it from the basement, and we must either do this or die." Then he turned to regard me, and my hand twitched, as though with its own life, and I was unable to look at him. "Sarah," he said, "go to the garage and bring me the axe." I lay in Mother's lap in a corner of the bare living room as she combed through my hair with her damp fingers, and we could hear him in the backyard tearing apart the furniture as the heat lifted the paint from the walls and made our hair limp, while the night gave birth to a dry wind that rushed through the house in a sudden hot sweep. Soon he stopped, and we listened. Wind chimes gave a silver midnight chorus in the silence and the heavy stillness, and the air ceased its restless passage, grown empty and wearied, unmoving, dead. Winter. During the long wet days when the streets would fill with muddy rivers of rainwater and the windows would fog up with chilly gray air, I would sit and watch the silver liquid pools coalesce and change protean shapes over the glass, while the bare black limbs of crooked trees would stir against the sky the color of rust beyond them. Sometimes I would warm my stiffened hands by pressing them to the cooling sides of the oven and the bright lemony scent of the meringue pies. I would watch through the glass as loaves of bread rose warm and yellow beneath the tiny white bulb of the oven light. She would take hot meals into Father, who would spend the long days in bed with the door closed, and I would see him sitting there as I peeked in, a pale white form like a porcelain statue sitting at the edge of the bed, hair uncombed and shiny with oil, his face looking bare without his glasses, the curtains pulled shut. Mother would sit and read to me stories from the Bible in the afternoons, stories which seemed vivid and terrifying. Cain branded and exiled from his home, Jesus raising Lazarus from his dark cave, God's covenant with man after the flood in the form of a shining rainbow spread over the sky. Sometimes I would go to the window and look for the rainbow that would tell me that God wasn't angry with me anymore, but I never found it. Mother and I spent an afternoon gathering the dead things from the yard left behind in the passage of the floods, bleached palm fronds, dried things that had once been oranges, wads of sodden newspaper that left your hands black with ink, and in the backyard the splintered pieces of wood remaining from what Father had destroyed, which came apart in our hands as we stuffed it into trash bags. The earth was soft and wet beneath my toes as I waded out into the flooded front yard, with my jeans rolled up over my knees, my passage causing the dirty gray water to come alive with hordes of green and black dragonflies as I stepped over fallen tree branches, and the swollen carcasses of birds swarming with red ants. We sprayed the mud from the driveway with a hose, and I watched as the worms dredged up from the earth struggled against the force of the water as they were washed back into the dead brown yard. And when I asked Mother why so many of them had died, she said it was because they had drowned beneath too much rain and not enough earth. I would search the sky for the sun, and occasionally I would find it, a dull, weak coin hanging restless and dry, waiting. Rain falls, flood streets, a little secret, Mother keeps. She said that I was never to leave the front yard when it was raining, or else I might be swept up by the currents and washed away like the worms. One day, while she was watering the plants in the house, I crossed the mud-blackened street and went into the orchard to see if the tree we had stolen from had any fruit left on it. My feet sunk to the ankles in soft red earth, and the mud felt cool against my skin as I walked among the aisles of dried white trees gone a soft peach color from the incessant rain. And soon I could hardly see the distant brown facade of our house swallowed by ranks of rotten trees behind me. The orchard was silent, and when I paused I could hear the sound of flowing water somewhere, and I turned to see a withered bird rise from a dripping branch and sail off into the yellow sky like a ragged kite. Soon I found the tree near the middle, isolated as though purposely separated from the other trees around it. Shriveled brown lumps dangled from branches, and I took one of them and returned home with it in the pocket of my dress. When Mother discovered that I had disobeyed her and ruined my dress, she hit me with a wooden spoon until I screamed for her to stop, while bruises appeared on my arms and legs like discolored roses. She said that I was never to leave the house again. Father came to see me once during the winter on a bright, rainless day as I was sitting at my desk making drawings with colored pencils, soft pink and yellow and peach pastels, while the draining gutters flowed outside with oily water that became a lemony white in the gentle sunlight falling through my open window. The pictures I drew were of an angry red sun above a tiny house, surrounded by an old gray wall of bleached stones, and as I was looking them over in the mild air, I became aware of him watching me through the doorway, his eyes a clear, sober gray like rainwater, holding something between his hands, which, after a silent moment between us, he placed on my desk and stood back, hands in his pockets. "I brought this for you," he said, lingering awkwardly a moment, then retreating away down the hall. What he had given me was a small glass unicorn, about the size of a paperweight, fashioned of smooth, transparent crystal, so clear that when I held it up to the sun, tiny rainbows burst inside. I watched Mother cut the stems from a cluster of fresh black roses with yellow edges, then placed the bunch into a glass pitcher filled with water. I asked her why there were no roses in winter, and she said that it was because everything died sooner or later, and then I saw that her hands were trembling in the gold sunlight coming through the kitchen window, and I noticed that her face had become whiter than usual, like a dirty gray moon with hollow black spots, so I stopped asking her questions. Then one day she didn't come out of her room at all. Father began cooking meals and taking them into her, and I watched him prepare them for her every night as he moved about the kitchen beneath the dry white fluorescent, which made his face resemble an eyeless mask over which swarmed the shadows of black moths, which threw themselves against the light until they lay spent and dying on the linoleum countertop. I listened one night to him talking in her room as I stood out of view of the open doorway, and the soft hissing of the gentle rain poured steadily beyond him. "You've been down there, haven't you?" he said. And it scared me that I could hear his words trembling a little, because I had never believed he could be afraid of anything. "You know it's down there." "My God," he said, "all those chemicals. I told you never to clean in there." And it was then, while the squirming rectangle of pale rain moved over the floor at my feet, that I thought of the basement doorknob and how recently shiny it had seemed to me. I thought of all the cities in the Bible that were destroyed by God because they disobeyed their covenant, and I understood then that we were being punished by him for something that we had done. "Make her better," I told Father, and he sat watching me from his chair with sorrowful gray eyes. "Make her like the rabbit, and I promise never to steal oranges again." He looked at me in the weakening light as though he had never known me, his tired, sightless eyes resting clearly now behind his glasses. "Oranges?" he said, and when I waited for something more, a recognition of some kind, anything, he merely turned away and sat watching the dying evening light draw blood from the land like a syringe until it was white and motionless and made no sound at all. At night I asked God to make her well again, promising him, as I had promised Father, that I would never again disobey him. But the morning came when I arose in the cold ivory dawn to a silent house, and when I peered in Mother's bedroom, there was only a wrinkled bed imprinted with the shape of a recent figure, and the pale curtains fanning like cretonne wings in an icy wind. Father remained in his chair in the living room, a mute, slackened figure with dirty gray skin and yellow, unmoving eyes, peering beyond the parted drapes to the whitening morning outside. The smell of alcohol rose from him in a powerful wave as the chill draft picked it up, gently stirring the curtains. The shadows of bare trees striped over him so that he resembled a cracked figurine. I said nothing to him, merely stood in the unbearable silence waiting, and after a time he turned to regard me, his flesh peeling from the vinyl as he moved with the sound an eggshell makes as it is stripped from the tender white skin beneath. I looked at him, remaining mute as the moist air moved over us, because I knew that he had let the tall men take her away, knew that he had not been strong enough to resist them, and he saw that I knew, and looked away, drinking liquid from a crystal glass. I buried my orange a short time later in a soft red spot of earth in the front yard, directly across from the orchard. Remembering what Mother had told me, I packed the swollen earth with my palms, flattening it until there was only a bald oval in the brown grass, then sat listening to the awakening morning, the steady dripping of water into an empty pail somewhere, the rising roar of traffic out in the city, the bark of an agitated dog. I watched the spreading gold light as it painted the wet ground and shifted the shadows to fresh positions. The earth was cold beneath my knees, but I was unable to move for a time. Father's face appeared in the window eventually, looking with curiosity out at me sitting on the front lawn, and I stared at him until he went away. Then I stood beneath the rising giant of the sun, watching as it labored over the orchard in a bright scarlet path, and the cool air, which it could no longer warm, wrapped me in its gray shroud, and I wondered what it was I had ever been afraid of.